Enjoy your meeting.
Good afternoon, folks. We'll be getting started here in just a few moments. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a little bit after 3 o'clock Central Time. We'll get started on our REVA webinar. All of the phones have been muted upon entry, except for the 2 that will be joining me in speaking. And we'll talk about that more in just a second. But welcome. My name is Mark Schiffman. I'm the Executive Director of REVA. And we welcome and thank you for joining us for this important discussion. In addition to our REVA members, we are joined today by several other AMCs, and we wish them well and welcome them to our call. REVA, for those of you who don't know, REVA is a 501c6 nonprofit association representing appraisal management companies committed to excellence and quality. Together, REVA's members represent about 70% of the U.S. residential appraisal and valuation volume. And our focus as an association is advocacy, our background check program, and compliance. As we saw this past weekend at the recent Aero conference, things are changing quite a bit, in particular as it relates to these new rules that have been introduced. Today's presentation is really aimed at introducing the AMC minimum requirements, examining the rule by section, and assessing its major impacts. We'll also have a Q&A at the end of this discussion as well. As you look at the screen, we do have all of the phones muted. If you could mute on your end as well, in the event we do unmute, we don't want to get somebody's voice message or hold music. So if you could please do that, that would be appreciated. If you look at the lower left-hand screen, you will see what looks like a small notebook. That is where, if you click on that button, I'd like you to ask questions or comments. Those questions and comments will come directly to me. I'll be able to share those with our speakers throughout the course of the presentation. In addition, we'll be able to have a running record of this discussion. We are recording this session, and we'll be able to share it after as well. And currently, we're up to about 66 people participating, so that's fantastic. We will have some time at the end, as I mentioned, for Q&A. I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We're very fortunate to have Frank O'Neill. Frank is the Chief Appraiser for Stewart Lender Services, which provides appraisal management services nationwide. Frank's an SRA designated member of the Appraisal Institute, and he's currently a representative to the Appraisal Foundation Industry Advancement Committee. He's also serves on the board for the National Appraisal Congress and is an active participant in ARO and CRN. Frank has served as a member of the Connecticut Real Estate Appraisal Commission and was an active on the board of directors of the Connecticut chapter of the Appraisal Institute. Frank is also an AQB certified USPAP instructor. Laura Raposo is Vice President of Valuations Compliance for ServiceLink, provides appraisal management services nationwide. During her 9 years of experience in the housing and mortgage industry, she's built and managed compliance programs and has served as regulatory and compliance counsel. So without further ado, welcome Frank, welcome Laura, and you can still hear me, right? You guys are unmuted?
I can hear you, Mark.
All right, Frank, excellent. Okay.
All right, well, thank you, Mark, for that introduction, and thanks to each of you for joining us. In the next section of the presentation, as Mark mentioned, Frank and I will take turns discussing some of the key elements and the controversies surrounding the minimum requirements. We have broken this presentation out so that we're going to walk you through the minimum requirements in order, section by section. Then, Frank's going to cover what comes next, what regulatory changes are anticipated, what regulators are talking about. So to start at the beginning of the minimum requirements, section 1, the introduction. The 6 federal financial regulatory agencies announced minimum requirements for the state registration and the supervision of the AMCs. The federal final rules implement portions of FIREA and Dodd-Frank. The final requirements are going to become effective 60 days after they're published in the Federal Register. They're expected to be published probably in the next couple of weeks. In terms of the compliance dates, for federally regulated AMCs, they must comply with the minimum requirements no later than 12 months from the effective date of the final rule. For all other AMCs, it's driven by the state's deadlines. States will have 36 months to establish regulations for state-regulated AMCs with the potential for a 1-year extension. So moving on to the next section of the minimum requirements, the authority, purpose, and scope. The scope of the minimum requirements apply to states and AMCs that provide appraisal and management services in consumer credit transactions that are secured by a consumer's principal dwelling or securitizations of those transactions. And in a few minutes, we'll get into that, the definition section, and discuss that a little bit further. For the rules of construction, the minimum requirements specifically state that nothing should be construed to prevent a state from establishing requirements in addition to those that are in the minimum requirements. So these requirements, they set the floor, but not the ceiling. The rules of construction also indicate that they do not alter guidance in or applicability of the interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines or other relevant agency guidance. So moving on to the key definitions contained in the minimum requirements. For this section, I'm going to more or less first read to you the most pertinent definitions verbatim from the requirement, and then I'm going to provide clarification on what each of those definitions mean. The first definition I'm going to cover is affiliate. Affiliate is rather unhelpfully defined as having the meaning provided in 12 U.S.C. 1841. So if someone said to me, I don't know what 12 U.S.C. 1841 defines an affiliate as, and I don't want to look it up. And I agreed with them. I don't want to look it up either. What a pain. Oh wait, I'm an attorney. I love looking up regulations. So that's what I've done. And what it says under 12 U.S.C. 1841 is that an affiliate is any company that controls or is controlled by or is under common control with another company. So moving on to the next definition, the definition of AMC, we're moving more into the heart of the rules. AMC is defined as a person. Now let's pause just for a minute here. Someone reading these rules for the first time may think, wait a minute here, I don't work for a person, I work for a corporation. So fantastic, I don't have to read the rest of the rules. However, unfortunately, if you read on, the minimum requirements define a person as a natural person or an organization, including a corporation, partnership, proprietorship, association, cooperative, etc., and so on. So going back to the definition, an AMC is a person, as is defined in the requirements, that meets all three of the following. So number one, provides appraisal management services to creditors or to secondary mortgage market participants, including affiliates. The number two, provides such services in connection with valuing a consumer's principal dwelling as security for a consumer credit transaction or incorporating such transactions into securitizations. And three, within a 12-month period, oversees an appraisal panel of more than 15 state-certified or licensed appraisers in a state, or 25 or more in 2 or more states. Now note, an AMC does not include a department or division of an entity that provides appraisal and management services only to that entity. So now that we've covered the definition of an AMC, I'm going to give you some background and some clarification on what that definition means. So first, industry participants had hoped that the final rule would create a standard, uniform definition of AMC that all states would be required to use. Now, if you're a glass half full kind of person, the minimum requirements do set the floor for the definition of an AMC. However, they do not set the ceiling. As I mentioned a minute ago, the rules of construction specifically say that nothing shall prevent states from establishing requirements in addition to those in the minimum requirements. In the comments to the requirements, the agencies specifically note that states have the ability to implement more rigid requirements in regards to the definition of an AMC. So this creates the potential for inconsistency from state to state in regards to the definition of an AMC. The next point I want to make relates to what is and is not included in the definition of an AMC when it comes to the department or division of an entity versus an affiliate of an entity. The definition of AMC does not include a division or department of an entity if that department or division provides only appraisal management services to that entity. However, the definition of AMC does include an affiliate of a creditor or secondary market principal, even if the AMC only provides appraisal management services to the entity with which it is affiliated. So how the agencies explained this is that they are distinguishing between a department or division of an entity and the affiliate of an entity by stating that the affiliate is a separate legal entity, whereas a department or division is not a separate legal entity. My next point relates to whether appraisal firms are AMCs. This was something that there was a fair amount of controversy over when the proposed rules came out about whether the firm should be, an appraisal firm should be considered an AMC. So very generally speaking, one of the distinctions between firms and AMCs tends to be that appraisal firms employ the appraisers and they actually complete the appraisal, whereas AMCs typically use independent contractors and don't complete the appraisal themselves. In defining an AMC, the final rules make it clear that an AMC oversees a panel of licensed or certified independent contractor appraisers. An appraiser is considered an independent contractor if he or she is treated as such by the AMC for the purposes of federal income tax. So here's a couple examples. An appraisal firm that only employs appraisers and doesn't use independent contractors would not be included in the definition of an AMC. However, if an appraisal firm that has a hybrid model in that they employ appraisers and they use independent contractors, it would be included in the definition of an AMC only if it has 15 or more independent contractor appraisers in one state or 25 or more in 2 or more states. So moving on from the definition of an AMC on to the next definition that I'm going to cover, the definition of appraisal panel. I'm going to first read to you this definition verbatim, which is a little bit painful. It's a long definition, but then I'm going to break down to you what it means. So it reads that appraisers on an AMC's appraiser panel includes both appraisers accepted by the AMC for consideration for future appraisal assignments in covered transactions or for secondary mortgage market participants in connection with covered transactions, and appraisers engaged by the AMC to perform one or more appraisals in covered transactions or for secondary mortgage market participants in connection with covered transactions. So obviously that is a mouthful. What does that mean? Basically, the gist of it means that an appraisal panel includes both appraisers that are being actively used by the AMC and those that are not being actively used for assignments, but that are on the panel, and if they were, they could be assigned an assignment. In the comments, there is an interesting note that makes it clear that the definition of appraisal panel only applies to whether an entity is an AMC subject to the minimum requirements, and that this definition was not written to address how the AMC national registry fees will be calculated. So this is something that has been wildly speculated about how these fees are going to be calculated, and Frank is going to expand on this in just a minute when he talks about the appraiser panel size. The next definition I will go over is covered transaction. A covered transaction means any consumer credit transaction secured by the consumer's principal dwelling. So this extends the coverage of the minimum requirements in participating states to all entities that meet the definition of an AMC in providing appraisal management services related to consumer credit transactions secured by the consumer's principal dwelling for both federally related transactions and non-federally related transactions, even though FIREA and its implementing regulations have historically applied only to appraisals for federally related transactions. I'm sure all of you know this, but when they refer to federally related transactions, they're talking about credit transactions involving a federally regulated depository institution. So next up, we have the definition of federally regulated AMC. A federally regulated AMC means an AMC that's owned and controlled by an insured depository institution and regulated by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, or the FDIC. So this means that a credit union service organization is not included in the definition of a federally regulated AMC. And in the comments, they expand a little bit on what is and is not included. And a credit union service organization is not considered by the agencies to be federally regulated because they are not subject to direct oversight or regulation by NCUA. So in the next slide, Frank is going to talk about the appraiser panel annual size calculation. But before we move on to that, Frank, are you there?
I am here.
Good to hear. Do you have anything to add?
Well, I was just going to, you mentioned the potential inconsistencies in defining AMCs at the states that they may not use the minimum definition. And I think we've already seen some that have done something a little bit different than what we see in the final rule. It's going to be very interesting to watch as they apply those different definitions of AMC, and then when we find out finally what the AMC registry fees are going to be based on, because they'll have to compute it differently for the registry fee than they will for their own purposes, deciding how many AMCs they've got on their panel and how many people are on those panels. It's going to be quite an interesting thing to watch. So,
hey, Laura and Frank, this is Mark. Two things. One, I want to remind everybody, if you do have questions, the small little notebook-looking item on the lower left side of your screen is where you can ask questions of our speakers, and I can see them and we'll be able to make sure that they are able to see them as well and provide answers. We do have a question for you based on one of the definitions. Despite the federal definition as identified within the rules, are states at liberty to define an appraisal firm as an AMC for the purposes of licensing? So by that, are the states able to have a different definition of AMC than what the federal definition is?
Yes, unfortunately. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Laura.
Oh, sure. Unfortunately, yes. So they absolutely can have different interpretations. So the federal requirements are setting the minimum requirements, but if they wanted to broaden that interpretation to encompass additional types of entities, they absolutely could do that.
But as far as the definition of an AMC, there is only one standard that each of the states has to uphold, which is the same as the federal standard, or could states define AMC differently than what the federal level is defining?
They could do it differently. They could decide that, well, 15 and 25, maybe we want to set a lower standard and we're going to do 10 and 15. So if you have 10 appraisers on your panel in our state, then you have to register as an AMC. So, I mean, that would be one example. As long as they don't do less and make it less stringent than what the federal requirement is, if they make it more stringent, then they're allowed to do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Mark, I guess, are there any other questions?
Nope, that's it for now. Let's go to the next section.
Let's go to the next section then. In terms of the appraiser panel and the annual size calculation, the purpose here is to determine if an organization meets the definition of AMC. And like that, it can change from one state to the other, but the minimum in the AMC rule indicates that if you have more than 15 appraisers in one state who are independent appraisers, not employees, then you would need to be registered in that state. If you have more than 25 in 2 or more states, then you would have to be registered in every state that you are operating in. The way you count that, as Laura mentioned before, it's based on the earliest date that the appraiser either accepted the appraiser for consideration for future assignments or when they engaged the appraiser to perform a particular assignment. So that goes to what Laura mentioned before. I can have appraisers on the panel that we haven't actually used in this past year, but for purposes of determining whether or not we have to be registered as an AMC, those appraisers on the panel but not active would still be counted. If an AMC removes an appraiser, they would be taken off the panel as of the date that they sent the written notice, or if the appraiser receives written notice from an appraiser that they're asking to be removed, then they would be off the panel as of that date, or if the AMC received notice of death or incapacity, then again it would be the date that they received it. If an appraiser was removed from an AMC panel, but then subsequently the AMC added them back for future consideration or engage them for a new assignment at any time during the 12 months after they were taken off, then it will be as if they never left the panel. That would be the way they would count it. The 12-month period for counting appraisers on the AMC panel, many had thought that, well, gee, it would make sense if we could just do it on a 12-month basis, then it would be the same everywhere. But of course, anything that's going to be the same everywhere, the states don't seem to be on that page. And so the rule says it could be either the calendar year or some other 12-month period like their registration period. So it's likely that most states will have the 12 months coincide with their registration period. The ASC, in comments at the Aero meeting, indicated that it's up to the states to decide how to collect the panel sizes from the AMCs. How are we going to, if I'm at the state and I want to know how many appraisers a particular AMC has on their panel, how far do I have to go? And their answer was it could be as simple as on their renewal form or on their application form, how many appraisers are on your panel, and just get the answer. Or the other end of the spectrum would be the way the system works in Texas, where there's a detailed tracking system and you have to go online and register and pay to put them on and pay to take them off, and they know exactly who's on and who's not on and when they came on and when they left and all of that. So it could be anywhere within that spectrum. I'm hoping that not too many states will be as ambitious as Texas, but it's open to them to do that if they choose. Many have been concerned that the ASC would use the same appraiser panel size calculations when determining how much those national registry fees will be. But as Laura indicated, they made it clear that definition is only for deciding whether or not the company is an AMC. And the decision as to how to determine the registry fees is a separate issue and will be decided as a separately defined and may or may not be the same. Actually, we may know more about that next week, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. The fees that the AMCs pay for the National Registry are to be paid based on panel size, but there's a number of potential ways that they might approach that, and at least one of them was some sort of a flat fee based on the overall size of the organization, rather than down to person by person, appraiser by appraiser accounting. We won't know until we hear from the appraisal subcommittee exactly how that's going to be done. It could be that it's based only on appraisers who have performed work in the past year, or it could be that it's based on appraisers accepted on the panel but not actively used. Obviously, our input to the rules when they were exposed for comment was that it would be much better to base it on the appraisers who are actually active. That would be more, to our view, would be a more accurate way of doing it. We'll have to see. I think that there has been actually some concern on the part of the subcommittee that the way that they approach this could in fact end up providing them with way more money than they know what to do with. So that's actually a little bit reassuring that they recognize that there could be a lot of money that they don't really need, and so maybe they'll take a more conservative approach to the way they want to calculate this. One of the downsides would be if they included all the appraisers that were just on the panel but not working, would be AMCs would be looking to remove people that don't do work because they don't want to pay for them if they're not doing any work. But then a lot of those appraisers are going to be in the rural areas, and then you're going to have to go out and recruit somebody, which will mean that lenders and borrowers are going to have to wait longer for appraisals in those locations. So that wouldn't be the ideal situation all the way around. it remains to be seen exactly how they're going to calculate those registry fees, but we may very well find out next week at the appraisal subcommittee at least what they're thinking about. We've heard some discussion, but we haven't heard anything specific. On to slide 10, Mark, unless there's any questions.
No, nothing at this time. Please remember, if you do have questions, you enter them into the notebook on the lower left, and we'll make sure we get those to our speakers.
One big consideration for this whole thing is that AMC registry, setting up an AMC registration program for the states is voluntary. They don't have to do this. When FIREA was passed and they said that they had to set up a system of licensing and certification for appraisers, they said each state must have, and so everybody had to do it. This AMC registration thing is being done on a voluntary basis. And the final AMC rule does not compel states to establish an AMC program. States that choose to do it have 3 years after publication, after final publication, and this becomes a final rule to establish a program, and there's the possibility for a 1-year extension beyond that. So theoretically, we could be playing for the next 4 years waiting to know whether or not all the states will be involved or not. In any non-participating states, if the state doesn't pass a registration for AMC program, then no AMCs would be able to complete appraisals for federally related transactions in that state. That would leave lenders having to rely on small AMCs that are below, and they're not really AMCs under the definition, small organizations less than the 15 under that size threshold, or appraisal firms or individual appraisers, or if there's one available in that state, a federally regulated AMC, but that would only be for the one lender that is a part of. The results of not participating are likely to be a significant problem for the lending community and cause some negative impacts for consumers in those states. Those factors may be enough to encourage all states to enact a system. There had been some hope that the ASC or the agencies might serve as a backup regulator in any state that didn't participate, but that did not happen. The agencies looked at the laws and decided that they were not authorized to do that, so that will not be an option. Right now we know we have 38 states that have put a system into place. There are several of the remaining 12 who haven't yet passed the law, but they're actively working on or discussing or considering it. We know that Massachusetts has a law that's in play. Ohio's been working on theirs for a while. Rhode Island's likely to do something. Alaska's talking about something. There's some others too. So it's likely to get down to a very few that there'll be open questions on. But then, as somebody said at the Aero conference, it's not just the state agencies or the local appraisers who can propose a bill. It could be that REVA or the lenders or somebody else could come in and say, hey, we really need this in our state. Let's propose a bill. So that will be interesting to watch.
Frank, this is Mark. I do have a question on the states. What have we heard anything from New York in terms of whether they would move for an AMC registry?
That's actually an interesting question, since there was a lot of this stuff with appraiser independence obviously started in New York. As far as I know, I am not aware of anything that's been started in New York. There may be something, maybe somebody else knows something, but I have not heard any discussion of any proposals in New York yet.
Thank you.
Okay. States that elect to register AMCs would establish or must establish and maintain within the state appraiser certification and licensing agency a licensing program with the legal authority and mechanisms to review and approve an application for registration or a renewal application, to verify appraisers on the AMC's panel hold the correct state license and certification, to examine the books and records. They need the legal authority and mechanism to examine the books and records of an AMC operating in the state and require the AMC to submit reports, information, and documents. They also need the legal authority to conduct investigations of AMCs to assess potential violations of applicable appraisal-related laws and regulations. They need to be able to verify discipline, suspend, terminate, deny renewal of a registration. They need to be able to report any of those violations to the appraisal subcommittee and the registry of the AMC registry that they are working on building. Comments expressed some concern about the states and how they might interpret those requirements requiring examination of the books and the records of an AMC, and how that should, and hope that it would be clarified. Others hope that there be some additional guidance on what was needed on the expectations for states engaging in examinations of AMCs. The agencies have responded that states can exercise their own discretion based on their own priorities to supervise the AMCs and the agencies declined to provide additional guidance or clarification regarding the state's audits and examinations of AMCs. Consequently, there's some concern about the number, size, and scope of audits that the states might elect to undertake in the absence of such guidance. It was very interesting and actually gratifying for those of us attending the Aero conference, because REVA was very well represented, and in fact, two of our members were a part of a panel discussing what audits might entail and providing some interesting guidance and perspective for the state regulators in the room. And you could see them receiving that good advice, and at the same time it was building our credibility with the group. We weren't just up there complaining and saying, no, don't do this. We know that audits are a fact of life, and there's a lot that's involved, and I think many of them had no idea what could be involved. And then at the end, Alice Ritter, the attorney for the appraisal subcommittee, got up and made it clear, just to make sure all the states understand, that they need to have the authority to be able to do those audits, but just because some people think that audits are a mandate, that's not true. The rule says you have to have the authority, but not that you have to do it on any kind of a regular basis. It's there to assist the boards, not add burdens. So that was very good news for a lot of them and for us, that they could do a very simple kind of an audit, a list of questions that they ask for specific things. They could have a multi-tiered thing, which was one of the things that was suggested by our members, that you start with something simple, and then if you think you have a problem, you can go further and ask for more detail. But the whole thing about audits, now we know that there's going to be some states that are going to want to go farther than others, but the nice thing to know is as long as they have the authority, there's no hard and fast rule that they have to come in and send 3 of their staff members to live in your office for a week. That's not likely to happen. The ASC would accept a state's decision to just ask the AMC to report information as long as they have the power to go farther. Another aspect of the rules mentioned that final rules clarified that AMCs are not prohibited from allowing a trainee to assist in the completion of an appraisal. But the appraiser that's engaged by the AMC must be the licensed or certified appraiser that's supervising that trainee. So it doesn't outlaw trainees, but it says that we would engage a licensed or certified appraiser who is the supervisor, but it makes it clear that we're not prevented from allowing trainees to perform work. One other thing that was mentioned, and we'll talk about in a couple of minutes or a little bit later, the agencies will issue a separate rule to implement Section 1110 of FIREA regarding appraisal reviews. They considered whether to make that a part of this AMC rule and decided that it was a subject that they needed to address separately, so that is not included here. Mark, do you have any additional questions, or shall we move on to slide 11?
No additional question. Well, I'm sorry, we do. Can an AMC still choose not to use trainees?
Oh, well, yeah, and we have clients who choose not to use AMCs. It didn't say that we had to use them. It said that we were not prevented from using them.
Got it. Okay. And then in terms of just a clarification, something that we talked about, that that states can build on the minimums, but they can't structure anything that conflicts with federal law. So while they can make it more stringent, they can't do anything that might put them in a conflicting position with the federal rules.
That's exactly right. Yep.
Yeah, it's an important point we wanted to remind you.
One of the things that we'll talk about in a few minutes as well, because many of the states are going to have to now go back. Well, probably they're all going to have to go back and take a look at what they've got in their laws and compare it to what's here and see if they have any shortfalls. And the subcommittee will be going back and reviewing with them to help them through that process.
We can move forward, Frank.
All right. So slide 11, states must impose requirements on AMCs to require AMCs that are not owned or controlled by an insured depository institution to follow minimum requirements, such as register and be subject to the supervision of the states. The states must require the AMCs to verify that only state certified or licensed appraisers are used when a creditor or a secondary mortgage market participant engages in a federally related transaction. And the state must require AMCs to have processes and controls reasonably designed to ensure the AMC selects an appraiser with the requisite education, expertise, and experience to complete the assignment competently. There's another bullet in that, and it is direct the appraiser to perform the assignment in conformance with USPAP. And I honestly was quite relieved when I saw just that one word, direct the appraiser to perform the assignment in conformance with USPAP, or in accordance with USPAP, because there had been words floating around that said, ensure that the appraiser performs the assignment in accordance with USPAP. And as a USPAP instructor, I'm scratching my head trying to figure out, how am I going to ensure that the appraiser performs in compliance with USPAP? So this standard of directing the appraiser to perform in conformance with USPAP is a great relief for me, at least, and I'm sure for others. The AMC must have processes and controls to ensure it performs its services in accordance with its obligations with respect to mandatory reporting, conflicts of interest, other acts or practices that violate valuation independence pursuant to TILA 129E, A through I, and AMC's obligations as creditor's agent with respect to appraiser compensation, specifically 129E, I. So that's customary and reasonable. And there were a number of concerns about customary and reasonable. We know that the law says you have to comply with TILA, and many states have written it that way. But the way this is written, some are going to read it as an invitation to go further into that whole topic. There was much discussion at Arrow and much concern, and I think quite a bit of discussion back and forth. We're likely that this is going to be a topic that we're going to hear a lot more about as we move forward. The agencies said that it's outside the scope of their rulemaking to comment on what mechanisms a state agency may use to assess a party's compliance in connection with any authority the state has to commence civil action to enforce 129E of TILA. The final rule sets minimum standards for states to adopt in establishing state program for registering and supervising AMCs. Once adopted, these minimum standards become a part of the state's legal framework for licensing and registered AMCs. Questions concerning what authority a state may confer on its own agency to supervise for and enforce compliance with the state's licensing and registration program are outside the scope of this rulemaking. So they're basically bouncing the ball onto the state side. They can, what they pass into law is what they get to enforce. So most states have approached this topic by focusing mostly on the appraiser independence and with some reference to the federal TILA law regarding customary and reasonable. Some have gone more aggressively into this, and we're likely to see more states consider whether they want to go further into this or not. Some states we already know just do not want to get heavily involved in regulating fees, but there's others that really want to take a closer look at it. So it's going to be one to watch. And that 2-hour session that was mentioned, I think earlier at Arrow, there was about 2 hours spent mostly talking about customary and reasonable fees. There's a lot of concern, a lot of interest, a lot of trying to figure out what's the right way to go about this. There was some discussion of the cost-plus model. There was discussion about Louisiana as a state that has robust customary and reasonable in place. The regulators pointed to the fact that the fees in some of the surveys appeared that the fees that the AMCs were paying were something less than the other things that were being reported. We all know that there's some issues with the way those surveys are done, but there's going to be lots of discussion about customary and reasonable. We will need to be vigilant and watch this in anything that comes up at the federal level as well as state by state. All right, I think that's all I've got. I don't know if there's any questions, or maybe Laura has a comment. Laura?
I don't have anything to add, and it looks like there's not any questions.
Nope, nothing at this time.
Sorry, what?
There aren't any questions at this time.
Okay. So moving on to the next section of the minimum requirements, the requirements for federally regulated AMCs. This section of the rule covers requirements about the federally regulated AMCs, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because there are a few federally regulated AMCs left. The comments to the requirements indicate that the agencies identified about 32 entities that are federally regulated AMCs, but they said that some of these may not even be subject to regulation under the minimum requirements because their panel size may not meet the statutory threshold for the definition of AMC. So regarding federally regulated AMCs, they must comply with the minimum requirements so that, for example, they must engage only licensed or certified appraisers for federally regulated transactions, use appraisers that are independent of the transaction and have the requisite education, experience, etc., direct the appraiser to comply to USPAP, and so forth. Federally regulated AMCs must also report information to the states in which they operate so that the ASC can determine the AMC National Registry fee and add them to the registry. Moving on to the next section of the requirements. This section is information to be presented to the ASC by participating states. This covers information, basically each state that registers AMCs must submit to the ASC any information that the ASC requires be submitted to it. The ASC is going to have regulations and guidance concerning what sorts of information must be reported to it for AMCs to operate in the state. And this concludes the section-by-section analysis of the minimum requirements. In the next part of the presentation, Frank is going to talk about what's next. So, earlier Mark mentioned, the next 36 months, we're expecting to see a lot of things going on. We're anticipating regulations and policy statements to come out, changes to existing statutes and regulations. So Frank's going to dive into that, and then he is going to talk about some of the comments provided by regulators regarding the minimum requirements. It's fortunate that the timing of the AERO conference and the minimum requirements came out. So at the AERO conference, we were able to hear from a lot of the regulators about what their thoughts are and what they're thinking is next. So Frank, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, Laura, thank you. Well, first on tap is the appraisal subcommittee meeting that's next Wednesday, May 13th at the Federal Reserve Building in Washington, D.C. The AMC registry fees are on the agenda for discussion and possible action. There are several of us from REVA who will be present for that meeting. The expectation, I guess, is that we may, in fact, hear their action on how that's all going to work. It would play nicely right after the final rule comes out to have that information. That would give the states most of what they need in order to reassess where they are. While we were at the AERO meeting, we had several, I think there was 5 or 6 members of the staff from the appraisal subcommittee present. One of them was their technology person, and he said that they are actively working on that AMC registry technology, and that they expect to be done with that, and it would be available to the states about 3/4 after the AMC rule is final. And since the AMC rule is going to be, they say it's going to be published in the Federal Register this month, that would mean 3/4 after that. So we're roughly talking about Q1, Q2 next year sometime. Of course, anything that's technology, that there's going to be some variation. Early estimates may not work out exactly what they want, but sometime in that time frame is when we're likely to see it. There's going to be a lot of interesting logistics there for the states, figuring out how to get information in there and how to hook up to it, and they're pushing the states to make a direct connection, integration into the registry for their appraiser information. They'll probably be doing the same thing for the AMCs, but there's the logistics for collecting the fees at the state and then passing them on to the appraisal subcommittee. We heard from several states that indicated that there was going to be a number of challenges for them figuring out how to get that done and how to handle that both legally and then financially. The appraisal subcommittee also let us know that they are working on new policy statements that would come from the subcommittee in addition to this final rule. They're likely to go back to the folks who wrote the AMC rule to get a little more background about what did you intend. The policy statements will be exposed, published for comment. They described it as a high priority item, but they couldn't make any commitment as to when exactly that would happen. They will announce a target date. Alice Ritter indicated that issuance is subject to approval by all 6 agencies, so that by itself is going to add a little bit of time, but they said that they hope to publish within about 6 months. That would be the exposure draft, if you will, but they hope to publish within about 6 months. That'll be another thing that states will be interested in seeing as they're reviewing their laws and regulations. The subcommittee indicated that they would they expect to issue a bulletin with some of the basic information prior to that. They say that the rule is pretty clear and that the policy statements will just add clarity, so they're trying to encourage the states to go ahead and get started with their reviews. And they also indicated that there may be a Q&A that would be sent out having to do with the rule and the policy statement. So at the point that all of that is in place, if the states haven't already gone back to review their laws and regulations, they will need to do that. And then the next slide, Mark, we have the regulatory agencies, all those federal financial institution regulatory agencies. Carmen Hawley from the Federal Reserve spoke at the ARROW meeting. She acknowledged, hey, the AMC rule is done. The next up is the rule that they are already working on about AVMs. Then they'll move on to appraisal portability, DPOs, and one that will be of significant interest to us, or certainly to me, is appraisal review. There'll be a lot of discussion probably having to do with all of those. They acknowledge that the interim final rule is really still it's still technically still open for comment right now. There's been a lot of discussion about appraiser independence that could get revisited. They're working on the mandatory rules first. They still have a lot of work to be done on rules that were required under Dodd-Frank that have not yet been developed. The Federal Reserve had 90 days to do the first version of that interim final rule. Very difficult to accomplish. They got it done, but the comment period is still open. Do they want to open it up all the way? Maybe. Do they want to just open it up for specific areas? That's another possibility. They acknowledge that studies in 3 states indicate that the fees that AMCs are paying may be less than other things, but they also acknowledge that AMCs go through a competitive process and the appraisers have the option whether or not to accept the fee. So they made the comment, this is going to be an ongoing discussion. We'll see how it plays out, but that is something that, not something right away, but something down the road that we may very well see. Mitch Plave from the OCC indicated that the extent to which a state participates in the investigation of AMCs is up to the states. States determine how much time to spend and the amount of effort for supervision and enforcement. So that reinforced what Alice Ritter had said. We know that there's 38 states that have registration now. They're all going to need to go back. I have talked to several people in our organization. Nobody could think of a state that has language in their law already that's going to be sufficient to implement the collection, to enable and implement the collection and forwarding of AMC registry fees to the ASC. So they're all going to have to go back in there to do something having to do with those registry fees. Once they open it up and they start looking at the final rules and any policy statements to see if there's any minimums that they haven't met, there's going to be, the door is going to be open to any number of other creative solutions that might be suggested. And then, of course, we still have 12 states plus the territories that will be considering enactment of AMC laws. So my comment is that REVA is positioned to be of tremendous assistance to all of us as AMCs to stay up to date with those new developments and to have an effective voice in the development of the many new layers of regulation that are facing our industry over the next few years. Mark, additional questions?
Yes, thank you, Frank. Thank you, Laura. We did have some questions. One is a comment. Frank, when the ASC is considering its fees for the National Registry, is it considering only a per appraiser fee or a flat fee, or do you have any idea what kind of scheme they're thinking of in terms of what that fee will look like?
Well, we don't know for sure because they haven't exposed anything, but we've had informal discussions with some of the folks from this subcommittee, including Jim Park, who have indicated that they are looking at a number of different options, one of them including some sort of a flat fee arrangement. And when that was